Our guest this week on Veterans Chronicles is U.S. Navy Admiral James Stavridis, who retired in 2013 after a very distinguished 37-year career. He is also the author of numerous books, most recently The Leader's Bookshelf, which we'll discuss in more detail later in our conversation. And Admiral, thanks very much for being with us.
It's great to be with you. Thank you very much.
Let's start at the very beginning. Where were you born and raised?
I was born in South Florida and then raised in a Marine Corps family. My father transferred every 2 or 3 years, so we lived in Camp Pendleton, Quantico, Virginia. We lived overseas, perhaps most interestingly, for 3 years in Athens, Greece. But I ended up attending high school in Arizona and then went to the U.S. Naval Academy.
Was that largely due to what you witnessed with your father and his Marine Corps career?
Very much so. I, in fact, went to Annapolis absolutely imbued with the Marine Corps spirit, certain I was going to be an infantry officer like my dad. And at the Naval Academy, after your first year, your plebe year, which is not a lot of fun, they then take you out to sea and put you on a, in my case, a cruiser. And they took me to San Diego, put me on a cruiser. And my first night underway, I walked up on the bridge, and I was like St. Paul on the road to Damascus. I suddenly saw what I wanted to do. I wanted to be a sailor and ultimately to command ships and spend a great deal of my life at sea. And I'm glad I did. Made my dad a little bit sad that I wasn't a Marine like him, but he was the impetus that got me started to Annapolis.
Surface warfare is what you pursued. Why that as opposed to submarines or aviation or anything else?
Yeah, I think it goes back to the fundamental reason to be in the Navy, in my view, is to be on ships and to be at sea. If you're in a submarine under the water, you don't have that experience, and if you're in an airplane flying over it, you don't have that experience. There's something that calls to me about the oceans. I'm fundamentally a mariner. I always say there's 70% of the earth is covered by water, and 70% of our bodies are made of water. There's a affinity there that really spoke to me. So I spent a great deal of time at sea, had a nice office with a view for much of my career, and enjoyed every minute of it.
Of course, when you graduate from the Naval Academy, you're an officer. As you grew in those early years, who were some of the mentors, or even at the Academy, who were some of the mentors that helped to stoke the initial leadership philosophy that you grew to embrace?
Sure, 2 really stand out, and they were both actually at the Naval Academy. They were young lieutenants at the time. One was Lieutenant Michael Mullen, who went on to 4 stars and became the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and the other was Lieutenant Bob Natter, and he went on to 4 stars and became the commander of the Atlantic Fleet. Both of them I got to know when I was a young midshipman. They both inspired me to be a surface warfare officer. Both had combat time in Vietnam. I really looked up to them, and they just kind of reappeared again and again in my career. They were mentors in a very classic sense and were very much a part of my life and career and remain very dear friends today, but still very much mentors.
A lot of different missions, a lot of different deployments, obviously, in those early years. Any stand out as particularly the one where you realized exactly why you were doing what you were doing, whether it was conflict, whether it was humanitarian, where it just fully came home what you were doing and why you were doing it?
I'll give you 2 from the very early part of my career. The first ship I went to was a Spruance-class destroyer. These are the first ships that had gas turbines in them. They were new and modern at the time. I was the anti-submarine warfare officer. It was the height of the Cold War. And I remember the first time we really were in a pitched, not battle, but a pitched situation with Russian warships. And we were tracking a Russian submarine, and it suddenly felt very real. You really understood that while we weren't in open combat at that time, it was very clear that this kind of hunt for Red October was anything but a game out there. After that ship, I spent 3 years on it. I then went to an aircraft carrier. I went to the Forrestal, which was a big, old, very broken down ship. Famously, it had a horrific fire during the Vietnam War. So I got to the Forrestal in 1980, and the Navy was in a bad place. This is when drug use was rampant. It was before the Reagan buildup sort of rescued the armed forces. And on that ship, I was the boilers officer. So I had about 150 very aggressive, almost like pirate crew down below decks. And it was hot, it was dangerous, and we had a terrible fire, and we lost 4 of our crew members. They died in this fire. And again, that sense of the reality, the danger of what we do at sea hit home to me. And as I do this interview in the early summer of 2017, we've just seen USS Fitzgerald, Arleigh Burke destroyer, hit by a merchant ship. 7 of those sailors died. I suspect that young captain in command is having the same kind of feeling that I did way back in 1980 when you first lose sailors who are part of your team. That hits and it hurts.
You mentioned the Reagan buildup in the 1980s. How was life different for you by the end of that decade as opposed to the front because of that different shift in priorities?
Yeah, it was delightfully different in the sense that the Reagan funding for the 600-ship Navy manifested in the surface Navy with the creation of the Aegis Combatants. So these are Ticonderoga-class cruisers, were the first of them. I was lucky enough to be selected to be the operations officer on one of the first of that class. And to suddenly be on a very high-tech ship with beautiful combat systems and a hand-picked crew, that's what convinced me to stay in the Navy after having gone through some very tough times on the Forrestal. I almost got out after the aircraft carrier, but the Navy kept me in by sending me to graduate school. I did a PhD at the Fletcher School. The Navy paid for all that. And then putting me on this beautiful brand new Ticonderoga-class cruiser kind of reinstalled my faith in the Navy. So the 1980s were very good to me with the Navy.
Early to mid-90s, you're in command of the USS Bari, and those years provided some issues that were certainly in the headlines: Haiti and the coup, and then the reversal of the coup that happened there, as well as the atrocities in Bosnia. You were assigned to that as well. What role did you and your crew play there?
Yeah, I always say about that tour on the Bari, it was almost 3 years long, and we had 3 big real-world missions. One was Haiti, as you mentioned, which was kind of a cross between a soft power, hard power mission. We were trying to make sure that the weapons did not get into Haiti, but at the same time we were moving humanitarian supplies in. A very tense time there in the Americas. The second big operation was the Balkans, and Bari's role there was to conduct what was called Operation Sharp Guard, which again was an arms embargo to prevent the Milosevic regime, a very aggressive Serbian team that was trying to take over chunks of the Balkans. We were there to prevent them from receiving weapons, and also to screen anything moving in and out, and to provide air defense for the aircraft that were operating. The third thing we did in Bari was go to the Gulf when Saddam Hussein in 1993 started to edge back down toward Kuwait again. And it appeared he was going to take another bite out of the apple. So we were tasked to accompany the carrier George Washington through the Suez Canal at high speed and all the way up to the northern part of the Persian Gulf. That show of force, I think, prevented Saddam Hussein from re-attempting to take over Kuwait. So it was a very full operational tour on the Bari, and I enjoyed it immensely. The ship won an incredibly important leadership award, which was the Battenberg Cup as the top ship in the Atlantic Fleet. Everyone felt terrific about that.
What did that do for your men, specifically winning the Battenberg Cup, and what did that require to get them in the position to win it?
I think above all, it required teamwork and building coherent teams in the crew. And secondly, it required innovation, new ideas. And thirdly, above all, we had to communicate a vision of the ship. We were able to do all of that quite effectively. And the ship came together to win that award in very positive ways. I always say the Bari had a solid wardroom and a very, very capable crew. But what really distinguished us was our chief's mess. We had an extraordinary group of chief petty officers, and it's a good example of how important that middle level of management is.
Let's move ahead a little bit. Obviously, shortly after that run, we have 9/11, and that changes virtually everything, certainly the focus of the military. Where are you at that time, and how does it affect you and your crew?
I'm in the Pentagon on the morning of September 11th. I'm a newly selected one-star officer, and waiting to actually have a mentoring seance with a young officer who's coming to meet with me, then Lieutenant Commander Rob Chadwick. And out of the corner of my eye, I kind of glimpsed through the windows on the E-ring the airplane. And yeah, I saw the airplane hit the Pentagon. And it was, shocking in every dimension. I couldn't quite process it. I thought perhaps it was a truck bomb or something had gone off. I wasn't sure really what I'd seen. And I didn't know until I saw news reports that it was another airplane. But where I was on the fourth floor, about 150 feet from the impact point, and everything filled up with smoke. A number of us tried to move toward the fire to see if we could rescue anybody. It was clear no one was going to be rescued from that section anyway. So we egressed and went out onto the green in front of the Pentagon. And fortunately, the real heroes of the day, the first responders, showed up and took over the space and kind of pushed us off to the side. And eventually, I walked home, probably 12 miles to my home in Alexandria, because as you may know, effectively the city was completely shut down. And it was a very much, like I think for all of us, a extraordinarily impactful moment. But for me, what I realized was the irony of the moment really struck me, that I'd been through all this sort of combat experiences and been in danger plenty of times, but I was almost killed in the Pentagon, behind all these concrete walls, protected by the strongest military on earth in the capital, the richest country in the planet. And what it showed me was that our opponents are going to find ways to get around walls. And one consistent theme in my life and career has been, we shouldn't rely on walls. They won't work. We should try and build bridges, both in positive ways and also with allies. So when we do have to use hard power, we do it in concert with others. So for me, it was obviously personally shocking moment, but it was also a kind of epiphany that guided the rest of my career philosophically.
What did that mean for your immediate future? Obviously, that led almost immediately to Operation Enduring Freedom, and then less than 2 years
later. It did, but it actually put me in one of the more interesting jobs I had in my career, which was to be the first director of something called Deep Blue, which was a innovation think tank put together by the Chief of Naval Operations after 9/11 to try and understand and create the right role for the Navy in fighting what we then began calling the War on Terror. Let's face it, a Navy isn't particularly optimized for that kind of operation. So what the Chief of Naval Operations, Admiral Vern Clark, asked me to do as a one-star was pick 15 people from around the Navy, SEALs, submariners, bring them together and generate ideas. We didn't have resources, we didn't have line authority, but we reported directly to the Chief of Naval Operations. If we could convince him it was a good idea, it happened. So we created, in the year I was there, a number of innovations that exist to this day: expeditionary strike groups, carrier strike groups, the idea of special forces operating off afloat forward staging bases, rotational crew operations. All that came out of my time at Deep Blue. And thus I had this intense one-year sojourn in the Pentagon post 9/11. And then I went right to Strike Group Command. I commanded Enterprise Carrier Strike Group. We conducted combat operations in Afghanistan, Iraq, and on the Horn of Africa.
What kind of operations?
Largely strike, but also surveillance, intelligence, electronic warfare, counter IED detection. We also put the SEALs ashore. We supported them in a number of classified missions. We conducted ballistic missile defense. We kept the Strait of Hormuz open against Iranian pressure. It was a pretty rich basket of operations. We launched thousands of strikes in that period. That was primarily the thrust of it, was power projection into Iraq, Afghanistan, and the Horn of Africa.
Any particular threats? Obviously, the Taliban doesn't have a navy.
Taliban in Afghanistan, so we're taking on those targets, doing close air support there. We've got, at that time, thousands of special forces in Afghanistan, but the primary effort at this point then quickly becomes Iraq toward the end of that mission, And down in the Horn of Africa, it's what today we think of as Al-Shabaab. But if you'll recall, after that 9/11 period, and by the time I'm in the strike group and forward deployed, it's 03, 04. This is when we're really fighting a three-front war in and around the Arabian Gulf. Enterprise was involved in all of that.
2006, you get a new assignment.
I do.
Commander of Southern Command. And
Yep.
obviously with all the turmoil going on in the Middle East and in certain places in Africa, which you've already talked about, and other places in the world, people think of that as a little more calm, and in many ways it is, but it certainly pops up different threats at different times. They had FARC and obviously chaos in Venezuela in a bunch of different ways. What were some of the biggest concerns during those 3 years?
I think before we get there, there's a very interesting 2-year assignment. I'm the senior military assistant to Secretary of Defense Don Rumsfeld.
Oh,
so as a 3-star officer, I accompany Rumsfeld everywhere he goes. I function as sort of his conduit to the military. I'm like it's like being the head of the National Security Council for the president. So for the Secretary of Defense, I orchestrated his meetings, brought information to him. His senior leaders, the combatant commanders, the service chiefs, are the ones advising him. But I become kind of the mechanic of that process. And as a result, I'm deeply embedded in both Iraq and Afghanistan. I'm there with Rumsfeld on multiple trips. It's a pretty fascinating 2-year deep dive into the war on terror and into Don Rumsfeld.
Oh yeah, I was just going to say a lot of different leadership type books have been written about the Rumsfeld way.
Right.
What did you learn from him?
Well, he himself has put together a book called Rumsfelds Rules, and he kind of follows those rules. And it's actually not a set of 1, 2, 3. It's bits and pieces of philosophy and ideas that he's picked up here and there over the years, and then he kind of melds them together. I would say what Secretary Rumsfeld represents is someone who is always direct and honest. He is unbelievably energetic as a leader. He's into everything. He's got a questing mind. He does not slow down to take a lot of care of people, but he quietly takes care of people on the backside of their duties. A very dynamic leader. Certainly policy-wise, you could have some arguments with some of the things that occurred and some of the decisions, but as a leader, he moved the Department of Defense in a very forthright manner and a very patriotic manner. I have a lot of regard for Secretary Rumsfeld.
The right leader for that time?
I think so. Certainly you'll get a variety of opinions, but I think he put his whole heart into that mission, and I respect him for it.
Let's talk about Southern Command now. What
Sure.
were some of the greater concerns there?
Yeah, so then I go to Miami, where the headquarters of Southern Command is, and it's a completely different world down there. I don't want to say it's, kind of a backwater, but it's a place where, compared to what's happening in Iraq and Afghanistan and NATO, it's quieter. You have more rhythm in what's going on. The big challenges are counter-narcotics, Cuba and our ongoing challenges with them. Venezuela at this time is run by Hugo Chavez. There's a kind of a left-wing political movement spreading in places like Nicaragua, Ecuador, Bolivia. So you feel not always welcome in that world. And during the time I was there, Argentina flipped. And the centerpiece of it all, however, was Colombia and the counterinsurgency that the government of Colombia was fighting against the FARC, which is an acronym for the Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia, which is a Marxist group. Here in 2017, finally, after 60 years, Colombia has executed a peace agreement and now is in a better place. But in those years, when I was there, 06 to 09, it was the height of that war. And we were, the United States, were supporting the Colombian military. So it was a lot of precision-guided weapons, a lot of interaction with our CIA colleagues, a lot of intelligence gathering and information sharing. So really a fascinating assignment. I was actually born in Miami. I speak Spanish, so it's very comfortable for me to operate in that environment. And at the end of it in 2006, I resigned. I retired. I sent my retirement note to Secretary Gates, thinking that would be the end. And he surprised me by asking me to go to NATO and be the first admiral to command NATO. So that happened in 2009.
Two questions on that. What did it mean to you to be the first Navy man, to be the Supreme Allied Commander? And secondly, when you're a military leader, you got a whole bunch of different things you need to coordinate and people to keep happy, or at least have their ear, or they have your ear. Now you've got a whole bunch of different countries who you need to get along well with. So how did you make that adjustment?
Well, I was pretty shocked by the assignment. In the back of my mind, I had kind of been hoping that perhaps I'd go not to EUCOM and NATO, but rather go to PACOM, to the Pacific Command, which is generally where admirals go. And Secretary Gates has always wanted to kind of shake things up, and he knew that I speak French and Spanish, I'm Greek American, I have that whole package. He felt like I would fit better in Europe, so he asked me to take that on. And I wasn't particularly deep in NATO. I'd studied it as a young officer at Annapolis, and then a bit when I was doing my PhD at the Fletcher School, but I was far from a NATO expert. So to be honest, I went into it with a great deal of trepidation. I wasn't sure I was the right fit. It had always been a general before. Generally, people who'd had 4 or 5 tours in Europe. It was a very daunting assignment for me. But I spent a lot of time learning on the way. I went around and met with everybody I could think of. I talked to all the living former Supreme Allied Commanders and spent, I think, a fair amount of diligence trying to understand the key issues in Europe at the time. When I arrived, I had a very warm welcome from, at that time, 27 other nations. Now we have a total of 29 now. Montenegro just joined. When I arrived, we had just added 2, Albania and Croatia, to come to 28 total. And I began by going around to each of the capitals and learning and listening and trying to understand the culture and history of each of the allies. And then gradually, after 6 months, I felt I had enough knowledge to start trying to put program together. So we worked on Afghanistan. That was kind of job one, big NATO mission. I had 150,000 troops under my command there. We had almost 25,000 in the Balkans, still kind of reminiscent of the wars of the Balkans. We had about 5,000 to 10,000 on any given day doing piracy off the coast of Africa. We obviously had a big structure for deterrence against Russia, which at this time has just invaded Georgia, and Putin is beginning to really show his character, if you will. We also had a lot of work to do in cybersecurity. We had a lot of work to do in the Arctic. So it was a big basket of work, but I would say 50% of all my time was devoted to Afghanistan. I went there constantly. I had 4 good 4-star commanders who worked for me there. Stan McChrystal was the first, then David Petraeus, then John Allen, then Joe Dunford, who's the current chairman of the Joint Chiefs. They were good, solid subordinates. They were loyal. They executed the mission very effectively. I have a lot of regard for all 4 of them. And Afghanistan is now turning into a 15, 16-year war, 17-year war. We still have a way to go, and I wish I'd been able to bring more closure to that project. The greatest accomplishment, I think, of my time as SACEUR is that we were able to reduce the number of troops in Afghanistan. We set the tracks to go down from 150,000 to the current deployment, which is about 13,000. So the training programs for the Afghans that we put in place are what has enabled us to reduce by 90% the number of Americans there. During my time, I had 2,700 killed in action under my command. I wrote individual condolence letters to every one of them, just like Secretary Gates was doing. When I'm here in Washington, I'll go to Section 60, where most of them are buried at Arlington. We at least were able to turn that war over to the Afghans. Still have many challenges to go there, but that was sort of the centerpiece of the NATO tour. Piracy was a very successful story. We effectively eradicated piracy. Balkans, very successful. We've reduced now to under 5,000 U.S. troops in the Balkans, and that'll go down to 0 very shortly. So progress. The other piece of my 4 years was the war in Libya, which was 6 months, very intense. In the end, I think a successful tactical mission. We were able to prevent Gaddafi from massacring his people. And then his people rose up, overthrew him, killed him, and unfortunately the international system didn't stay engaged, and therefore Libya has descended into chaos. It's an example of you can succeed militarily, but you'll fail if you don't have the follow-on and the political engagement. Same lesson we should have learned from Iraq, frankly.
Real quick follow-up on that, because you've talked about smart power, soft power sometimes, hard power sometimes, but smart power. Define what that means.
When we look at the way nations apply power, sometimes they use hard power. That's generally kinetic activity, bombs, rockets, soldiers, tanks, kinetic, blow things up, kill people, hard power. Soft power, it's education, disaster relief, medical diplomacy, diplomatic engagement, economic tools, incentivizing. So often people make the mistake of thinking about these two baskets of tools as an on and off switch. You got to pick. You either go hard power or no, we don't want to use hard power, let's use soft power. That approach is mistaken. You need both. There are times when you absolutely need hard power. We're not going to negotiate a successful outcome with the Islamic State. We're going to find them and kill them. But the long game in places like the Balkans, Haiti, Colombia, even in the Middle East, the long game is about literacy and education. It's about economies that actually function. It's about water supply. It's about diplomatic engagement. It's about rule of law. Those basket of tools have to be applied. So instead of thinking of it as an on and off switch, think of it as a rheostat that you dial in. There are times when you need hard power, but there are also times when you need soft power. That rheostat is what some have called smart power, finding the right setting for the given crisis you're facing.
NATO, of course, was created in the 1940s as a way to resist the westward expansion of Soviet communism. Russia, as you probably know, has been in the headlines a little bit lately.
Yeah.
So during your time, what did you learn about the way the Russians operate and how to effectively deal with them?
Well, the first thing you have to understand about Russian culture and history is the primacy of the strong unitary leader. And that can work out pretty well for a nation, or it can be a total disaster. So Russia, they kind of roll the cosmic dice. And one time they get Peter the Great, but the next time they get Ivan the Terrible. And one time they get Stalin, but then they get a Gorbachev. Well, those dice have landed on Vladimir Putin. He's relatively young, early 60s. He's very vigorous. We see him take his shirt off all the time. We know he's fit. He's going to be around for a long time. He's not going to give up power. And therefore, point one about understanding Russia is you got to understand Putin. You got to read about him. You got to dive into the CIA reports. You got to analyze him. You got to take novels like Dostoevsky and Tolstoy and apply them against his psychology. You have to understand Vladimir Putin in the context of Russian history and culture. Secondly, Russia is a continental power, a land power. They want to control their borders. So you'll constantly see Russia, always in its history, and even today, pushing on those borders. That's what the invasion of Ukraine is about. That's what the invasion of Georgia is about. That's what the annexation of Moldova, parts of Moldova, is about. We'll continue to see that pattern with Russia. Thirdly, they're transactional. We can work with them, but not in an overarching, philosophical, I love you kind of way. With Russia, you have to pay to get. And if we understand that and look at them in a clear-eyed way and see that they're no friend to the United States, we'll do better at operating with them. And fourth and finally, I'll give you a Russian proverb. Russians say, when probing with a bayonet, if you encounter mush, keep going. If you hit steel, withdraw. Russians understand strength. We need a capable military, not one that is spring-loaded to go to war, but one that can create that sense of steel when the Russians hit it. There's 4 points to think about.
So projecting strength, even if it doesn't actually involve military action, is critical to keeping them in line.
Absolutely.
Well, as we mentioned, you are also the author of The Leader's Bookshelf, so
I
let's
am.
talk about that book
Sure.
now. What led you to write the book?
Two things. One is I have an enormous love of books. I lived in Greece when I was a little boy. There was no television. So instead of developing a television habit, I developed a reading habit. And I still read constantly. I'll typically get through at least 2 to 4 books a week. And I read late at night. I read on airplanes. If I have 10 seconds, I'll get out even my iPhone, open up Kindle, and be reading something. So I love to read. And the second thing is, I'm a believer that leaders are not born, they're made. And they're made by the gifts they get at birth, they're made by the way they're raised by their parents, they're made by the experiences they have, but they're also made by what they can learn from books. And so the book is an attempt to create an overview of, in this case, 50 selected books, many of which are novels, but some are history, memoir, biography, autobiography. It's a wide range of 50 books that people can read that I believe will help them become better leaders. And because not everybody has time to read 50 books, the heart of the Leader's Bookshelf is a very short, snappy summary, synopsis, a cliff notes, if you will, of each of these 50 books. And then it pulls out a little bit of information about the author of the book and a little bit of information about what are the leadership lessons. And then by the end of the book, we attempt to draw all that together to some fundamental ideas about leadership. So it was a fun project.
Should we be wary of people who want to be leaders that aren't curious and readers?
I think it's curious is the key word. I don't think reading is absolutely critical. I think it is, however, an enabler. But if you don't read, and frankly our current president, Donald Trump, famously says he never reads. He doesn't read a book. He gets his information watching television. He gets his information talking to people. He's very visually oriented. You can use that as a mechanism to improve your leadership skills as well. And so I wouldn't be so arrogant to say that, no, if you're not a reader, you're not a leader. But I will say, if you are a reader, it'll make you a better leader.
Interestingly, number 3 on the list is the Bible. Most people don't think of that as a leadership book, or
I've also heard leadership.
I've also heard a lot of military historians say there's tremendous military tactical wisdom there.
Yeah, both are true. And we should say a word about where these 50 books came from. These are not the 50 favorite books of Jim Stavridis and Bob Ansel, my co-author. We crowdsourced this. We went out to 200 senior military leaders, generals and admirals, and asked them what are their favorite books. And some of them gave us 2 or 3 books, and some of them gave us 150 books. And we just kind of did a mapping exercise and what were the books that were mentioned the most and tried to put some balance in it. But it's a crowdsourced list. And the Bible was very frequently mentioned. And not as a philosophical or a religious book, but as a book of leadership. And if you think about it, the parables are full of leadership stories. How does Noah man the ark? How does Jesus inspire the Jewish people? In every way, the Bible is a story of leadership.
Well, let's talk about the different types of leaders that you profile here, because some are politicians, some have nothing to do with the military or politics, like the 7 Habits of Highly Effective People.
Right.
Some are very high up, presidents of the United States, General Grant, for example, in his famous memoirs. Others are like Hal Moore in Vietnam, or others further down the chain. So,
well, I hasten to say, although there's a lot of military in the book, because we're crowdsourcing this from admirals and generals, there's also many novels that have nothing to do with the military. 2 that I'll mention that I love and I think have profound leadership lessons are A Connecticut Yankee in King Arthur's Court by Mark Twain, which is a work of science fiction, essentially, about a 19th century engineer who goes back in time 1,000 years. And he's brilliant. He knows everything. He knows the earth is round. He knows metallurgy and engineering. But he can't convince anybody of anything. So it's a book about innovation and how hard innovation actually is, how hard it is to convince others to accept the new. The other book, which you probably read when you were 13 years old, is To Kill a Mockingbird. Harper Lee, an extraordinary novel set in the South about a small-time lawyer who takes on a case defending an African American. It's a hard thing for him to do, but it's the right thing to do. He chooses the hard right over what would have been very easy, the easy wrong path. And at the end of that novel, the black parishioners, as Atticus Finch, that lawyer, walks out of the courtroom, one of them turns to his young daughter, Scout. It's also a coming-of-age novel, and says to Scout, "Stand up, young lady. Your daddy's passing." That's a leadership moment. That's a teachable moment. So many of these books are novels that I think also illuminate leadership qualities. There's two examples.
Is a good leader anywhere? So if it's
I think
a
so.
military leader, business leader?
Oh, I think absolutely. I think the things that hopefully made me a good leader in the military have helped me very much in my new life. I'm now 4 years as the dean of a graduate school of international relations, Tufts University, the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy. And the things I tried to do as a leader in the military were collaboration, communication, innovation, put it all on a kind of a platform of integrity, and above all, try and be a leader as servant. Not think of yourself as the high and mighty captain of the ship, but rather someone who enables others to achieve all that they can do.
A servant leader.
Yes, a servant leader, as I said. And I believe that part of that is never losing your temper, never being angry, never raising your voice. I have many, many faults and failings, and I have failed repeated times along my career. But you will never find anyone who could say, yeah, Jim Stavridis yelled at me, or Jim Stavridis raised his voice to me, or called me names, or I just don't think that's what leaders do. And I think all of those attributes work quite well, my experience, as I transition them into, in my case, the world of higher education. Do they work in business? Sure. Occasionally, you find leaders who aren't like that, who are not servant leaders, who are arrogant, who scream and yell, and they can be successful, but for a short period of time. It's very seductive to have a kind of a crisis style of leadership. Real leaders are building the enterprise for their successors. And I think that's a lesson that I took out of many of the books in the Leader's Bookshelf.
Would you say we're getting better in terms of leadership? Because you talked about kind of the old school brusque, I'm in command,
Yeah.
and not what you just described at all. On the other hand, it seems like there's more of a me mentality in today's society.
Yeah.
So
I think we are getting better, very much so. And when I think about the Navy that I went into in the early 1980s, there was a lot of screaming and yelling, and everybody was calling each other names and slamming shut the doors of the ship and locking everybody in if the captain wasn't happy with the ship or the crew. It was a lot of sticks, not many carrots. And over the 37 years I was in the Navy, I saw that change really fundamentally. Now we find those toxic leaders and we get rid of them. And you can't survive long-term in the Navy as we used to say, a flamer. And I think we are better. As a society, I think we are as well, except one thing I'll tell you, and I'm worried about it. It's over the last 5 years or so, I felt this polarization in our society. I think some have called it the result of what's termed in the journalism world the anger industry. And this is people retreating from common dialogue and taking themselves into small, angry echo chambers, listening to a particular announcer, reading particular kinds of books, watching particular television channels, and failing to understand the broad dimensions of our society. That's a worrisome trend. And I was asked the other day, what's my biggest security concern for the United States? Is it the Islamic State, the rise of Russia? China in the South China Sea. Those were all worries. Cybersecurity, yeah, we ought to worry about them, but we can face all those challenges if we do it together. What I feel now is a sort of pulling to the extremes. That's to be avoided, and I think there are mechanisms to address that, but above all, it'll require leaders who want to fight for the center.
You were reportedly considered as a running mate for Secretary Clinton. You were reportedly considered as the Secretary of State for President-elect Trump. So,
guilty.
Do you have any interest in entering that arena in order to facilitate what you just talked about?
First of all, I was vetted for vice president for Secretary Clinton, and at the end of the campaign, she asked me if I'd be willing to go into government with her, and I said I would. She was not elected, and I thought, well, at least my schedule has cleared up for the next 4 years. President Trump's team reached out to me and asked me to come and interview for Secretary of State. Ultimately, I was offered a cabinet level position, but I felt I was better placed outside the administration, and I'm very content with what I'm doing at the Fletcher School. I think that doesn't necessarily say anything about me, but the good thing it says is that both of those camps could look toward the center, and I think that's a positive. In terms of my professional plans, I'll say that I've always been one to want to serve the country, and I'll continue to look for opportunities to serve.
Last question, also on leadership, but also on the military. Someone who did end up in the president's cabinet is not only well regarded as a leader, but also as an extremely voracious reader, and that is Secretary Mattis. I know one former Marine officer who said he helped to move Mattis at one point to a new command. It was basically a bed, a table, one chair, and then everything else was boxes of books.
Yeah.
So,
yeah, I'm in the same category. I've got Jim Mattis and I have exchanged book recommendations for a decade. If you flip over the leader's bookshelf, you'll find an endorsement from General Mattis on the back. We're very close friends. I think, libraries vary. Jim's kind of let his atrophy over the years. I continue to collect books, kind of a gentle madness. I think I'm well north of 5,000 right now. But I think, again, I don't think it's mandatory, and you can be a good leader and not be a reader. But if you're a reader, you'll be a better leader. General Mattis understands that, and so do I.
Admiral, thank you very much for your service. Thanks for your time today.
Thanks. What a pleasure. Thank you very much.
Admiral James Stavridis, U.S. Navy retired, former Supreme Allied Commander at NATO.
And thanks for pronouncing my name perfectly.